So in general, we typically think about.
Hi, and welcome to the conversation about boundaries with Dr. Dowtin. Dr. Dowtin is a licensed clinical professional counselor, an early childhood school psychologist, and an early childhood specialist and trauma therapist. Dr. Dowtin is passionate about facilitating healthy social emotional development from conception through adulthood. In the episode, we covered the 6 types of boundaries, and we included examples such as what do you do when your kid is claiming that he's not hungry, or he doesn't want to shower, he says he's too tired, or even is not willing to clean his room. We also talked about why it is so important to model your inner conversation and why a parent might check his emotional capacity before responding to his child. Dr. Dowtin also mentioned the why behind kids' behavior, which we actually covered in episode 4, so I highly recommend for you to go and listen if you haven't done that until now. So let's give the music its place and get started. Welcome to the Playground Talks podcast, a podcast for busy parents who want to own their parenting style and develop a stronger sense of how to handle challenging situations. I am Tamia Friat, your host and a mother of 3. In this podcast, I will interview psychologists, practitioners, behavioral therapists, teachers, and other experts about topics that bother all of us as parents so you can get both the parenting principles and practical aspects that resonate with you, give you confidence and joy. Hi, Dr. Dowtin. How are you today?
Hi, Tammy. I'm doing well. Excited to be here.
I am so excited as well. We actually had a boundary episode already, but you were so genuine and you're willing to talk and dive into what kind of boundaries we have. So I'm really excited to have you here, and let's get started. How do you see boundaries and what type of boundaries are we talking to?
Yeah. So I'm going to talk a little bit about general boundaries first, and then we can maybe think about what it looks like with partnerships and parent-child relationships. So in general, we typically think about there being 6 different types of boundaries in general, right? And so you have physical boundaries that you can set. You can have your emotional boundaries. We have time boundaries. We have sexual boundaries, intellectual or mental, sometimes we'll call them mental, and then material boundaries. And so when we think about these in the context of parenting, we very often will use some of those physical boundaries. So if you're parenting more than one child, you have boundaries around hitting. You have boundaries around like kicking, so aggressive behaviors. Those are touch. Those are physical. You're setting, keep your hands in your own space, keep your hands and feet to yourself, things like that. With children, we also have material boundaries very often. There may be certain things in your house that are valuable that you don't want broken, or they can't play with them in the same way they would play with their own toys. Or maybe they're visiting someone in the family who doesn't have a child-proof home, right? And so you set a boundary around these material things. And we have our time boundaries, which are probably, as people with children, one of the most common because you're trying to like get them to appointments. And, we want to have a nap time scheduled if we can. And we want to do all these things. So we're setting these limitations around our time, right? We only have a certain amount of time. And it can be really good for children to have those warnings when it's a time boundary. And so instead of at the very last minute saying, okay, we have to go to the doctor's appointment, and, they were playing and they were excited, you're going to give some type of warning around that time boundary. So you'll say, oh, we have to leave soon for the doctor's office. You have about 5 more minutes to play. And even if they don't have a concept of time yet, then you're going to, give them one more warning. Just say, oh, we have just 1 more minute left. So we're going to start cleaning up, or we're going to start doing these things so that it's not abrupt. And then we have, with the sexual boundaries, typically we want to teach that to children too. And that's when we think about it overlaps with physical, but it's that, safe touch, body zones, what's okay for who to touch when, or like our bath time zones. Some people will call those like the bath time spots that only parents can help with, or grandparents, or, people who are helping you take a bath. But if they don't help you take a bath, then you have to set a boundary around them being allowed to touch you in those places. And then our intellectual boundaries, I like those a lot because those are almost always about us, the individual. So it's the things that you set in place. How do I respect others? How do I show my children what are the things that I need to be doing, right, to make sure that I'm showing up in the way that is appropriate for this parent-child interaction or for the outcome that I want later. So that your intellectual boundaries are usually all about you and not the boundaries you're putting on other people, but the limitations and the boundaries that you put on yourself in order to interact with the people that you care about.
So I like the intellectual boundaries. And before we dive into it, I want to go back and ask you, let's say that I am tired or my child is tired and saying, well, I'm tired. I'm not willing, I don't know, to go shower at the moment. What type of boundary is it? And also, how would you respond to it?
Beautiful. So I would think of that as the emotional boundary, which I'm glad you brought that up because I don't think I listed it, but I don't think I gave any examples. So that would be an emotional boundary because they're expressing tiredness kind of as an emotion. Like, I'm exhausted. I don't feel like it. I don't want to go, take this bath time or go to bed. So I would validate that emotion, something like, I hear that you're really tired. We've had a long day. So validate that, give them that space if you can. And then you would put in what the boundary is. So you would say, but it's actually time for bath now. And then you set the if then. So if we don't do bath now, then we can have the story time after bath, or I won't read you the story after bath. And the strong thing about this kind of boundary, you want to make sure that it's something that you can enforce. Often, as well-meaning as we are, we will think something like, oh, this sounds good, right? Like, okay. And then we don't realize that I'm not going to feel like doing that, or I'm going to feel guilty about not reading this story afterwards. I'm going to read this story afterwards. But then if we do that, then it's not actually a boundary. It wasn't clear, right? We weren't able to enforce it. And then it becomes really confusing later. We're going to be in that cycle with every time they're tired, we say this, that it drags out. And then they still eventually get the story, the bath goes in, or they don't even get the bath, but I read them the story anyway because I felt bad about it, So I would say, people laugh at me, but I would say you got to check in with yourself first. That's when you look at your intellectual boundary. Okay, do I have the capacity to do this? How can I make this interaction helpful? And if you're tired and you're like, I'm not going to be able to enforce this boundary, it's going to feel like a battle, no one's going to win, then you have to decide, okay, well, what do I want in this situation? Can we skip baths tonight? Am I okay with that? Right? And that's okay too. So allowing yourself that flexibility, because one of the things to remember is when you set a boundary, you have to be able to enforce it.
If you don't set and hold the boundary, you're not being consistent, and then it doesn't work. Yeah, I get it. And I also like the point that you raised, saying that guilt comes a lot in our way as parent to set the boundary. Because whenever we feel guilt, we step back, and then there is no consistency. There is no holding the boundary anymore. And the kids get it. And then, well, we just talked about reinforcement. So the reinforcement is that it will get worse, probably, because the kids got it.
Exactly.
I totally get that. I want to actually go back and ask you also. So in terms of my kid says, well, mommy, I'm not hungry at the moment. I don't feel like eating now. What kind of boundary is this?
Yeah, that's a good one, because we could look at that as either physical, if they're actually, maybe they're really not hungry, or we can look at it as an emotional. So, I think you had to talk about behaviors and kind of looking at the function of the behavior or why the behavior is happening. So there's a little bit playing into there. You want to be figuring out, is this because they just don't want to go to the table for some reason? Is this because they'd rather be playing with this preferred item over here? And like, if we go eat, then I can't play with my toy. Like, what is the function? So I'm going to look at that. Most of the time with kiddos and then young children, depending on the age, they really aren't hungry sometimes, and their appetites fluctuate and change. And that can be really hard for us as adults when we're trying to think like, I want my child to be healthy. I got to make sure they have balanced meals. You're trying to think of all those things. And we forget that the appetite cycle changes over time for children. And most adults don't have a good understanding of child portions, or even little things like children can get full off of drinking water or drinking your juice, right? So maybe they really weren't, because they were sipping on their juice throughout the day or sipping on water throughout the day. And it's like, oh, well, I'm full right now because I've had all these liquids, right?
Full with sugar that makes you feel full.
Exactly. It makes you feel fuller.
But you know what? You remind me that once my colleague told me that no child is starving to death in front of a plate full with food. And that's exactly what
Exactly.
you said. It's also in terms of timing. Sometimes we are hungry, but the kids are not. So I like how you said to respect the possibility they are really not hungry.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, think about it, right? The human body is set up to like want food. Like if you're hungry, you salivate, the smells get you excited, right? So if the food is good and they're turning it down, it's like, well, maybe you really aren't hungry. Or again, maybe this toy is way more enticing, like maybe whatever you're doing over here is really more enticing. And sometimes I think that we don't think about the fact that your affection and your attention can be so powerful. So maybe it's just like if you were playing with them or if you were reading a story with them and you're like, oh, now it's time to go eat. But like, I want to be with you. Eating means I have to sit in my own space and whatever the case may be. Like, I want to spend, this was fun, right? And so I would think about what are ways that you can kind of decipher that for yourself to see what's really coming up. Now, if you figured it out and it's not because they're actually not hungry and it's the time like we eat now. So we want to think about consequences and within some of these boundaries, right? When you're holding the boundary. So we have our natural consequence and we have a logical consequence. And you may already know about these, but a natural consequence is something that happens without intervention. So for example, if they don't eat now, they're going to be hungry later. It's natural. You didn't do anything. Just eventually our bodies get hungry. That's a natural thing that occurs. So you could just state and wait out the natural consequence and just let them know, okay, well, if you don't eat now, then, food will go away and you'll be hungry later. You're not intervening in any way. That's just natural. And then they can kind of learn about timing of food, their body, listening to their bodies, all those different things. Then there's a logical consequence. And so with logical consequences, those are the things that we are putting in place with as an intervention. I will say that a lot of times, if you work with children ahead of time to help come up with some of these logical consequences, then you're going to have a better buy-in later. And what I mean by that is you may be able to have conversations with children, usually as young as like 3, 2.5 and 3, like it's time to eat, but you don't want to eat. What do you think we should do about that? And just see what they say and see and then if you don't like what they said, you're like, what about this? And you kind of have a little bit of a conversation about it, right? So it's again, thinking about what are you willing to enforce? And I know like old school parenting, it's like, oh, well, you go to bed without dinner. And then usually one of the parents would be feeling guilty and like sneak food up.
Yeah. Actually remind me something that I asked my son the other day. He's 3, almost 3.5. So I was like, do you think your tummy's hungry? And he looked at his tummy and he was like, Mommy, you're silly. My tummy can talk. And I was like, but you can have this conversation with your tummy and let me know. So I was trying to make his own awareness of how much he's hungry, or sometimes they also mix hunger and when they are thirsty.
Yes.
So I like how you say to kind of start and develop their own awareness to their body.
Yes.
So it's a great thing. And I'm trying to go back to physical boundaries is more around my own room, like with my daughter. She's almost 11. And so I respect her own boundary in her room and I don't interfere and like I don't force her to clean it or anything, but I'm using the natural consequences, which is you don't clean it, it gets dirty, you might have more bugs. And then once there is one coming in, she's like, Mommy, I can't stand it. Call the pets control. And I was like, well, you might want to consider making it look nice first. So anything else to dive into the physical boundaries?
It's about your own personal space, touch, really good for children in preschool, because they usually talk a lot about physical boundaries in preschool and kindergarten, because kids don't know how to keep their hands to themselves.
One of my kids like strong hugs and like he likes to be touched. And the other person says, no, please don't hug me. I don't like it. And so this is another thing you can communicate with your kids. It's just there's a range of communication and showing your love in terms of touching your kids. And yeah, as a parent, sometimes we love to hug them so much.
Yeah, I love and it's becoming up a lot. I love this in society now, but just teaching children about consent. So physical boundaries include consent. It's one of the things that we're teaching. So, maybe sometimes we'll have things like, so I used to be a preschool teacher, and sometimes we'd have siblings. One time we had a set of twins in our class, and they fought. They tried to physically fight each other all the time because they were allowed to do that at home. So we had to set a physical boundary. Their parents had one that was, you two can fight each other physically because you're siblings, and you'll work it out and you'll figure it out. And so their parents were fine with it, but we're like, well, in school, we don't hit our friends. We don't hit our classmates. We talk about safety and we don't physically fight. Even though you're siblings, in school, this is the boundary we're setting, the physical boundary. So once you've put your foot across the threshold at school, we don't hit. And if you do hit, then, we're putting in a consequence. One of the things that we will give children for physical boundaries is options. And so asking other children, I want to greet you. Can I give you a hug, a wave, a fist bump, handshake, or high five? We might do some of those and give them a choice. And then the person can choose like, oh, I want a fist bump, sounds nice. Or I want a high five. Or no, thank you,
Like
just a
the
wave.
leveling of how much you can be in touch with. It's great. So in terms of intellectual boundaries that you started talking about, and I took the conversation to other spots. So let's dig into it. How would you set an example as a parent for intellectual boundaries?
Very good. So people laugh at me, but I use modeling. Most of us have an internal voice, like an internal monologue where we like thinking about things. Should I do this? We're kind of like talking to ourselves, but in our head, right? For parenting or working with young children, it's really helpful if you make that inner voice, inner monologue external sometimes, because you're allowing your children to see and hear what that process is like for you. And then they learn how to better do it, and they learn that the decision making. So for an intellectual boundary, let's just say when you were trying to learn to give your daughter her respect and her physical boundaries for her room, and you're like, well, she's telling me to get out of her room, but it's my house and her room is a mess, and I really don't want a room in my house that's a mess. At the same time, is that respectful? I want to be really respectful. So I would kind of have some of that conversation, and then I would decide, well, what am I able to enforce? What feels good for me? So, okay, I would talk this through. If I leave her room alone, if I let her do what she wants in her room, and then we maybe get bugs, there's natural consequences. She might start cleaning it up when she sees a bug or two, and we can kind of control a bug or two in our home. So I can be respectful of her by allowing her that physical space. And then I'm pretty sure you have maybe you don't even know it yet, but I'm pretty sure you have a limit. So maybe if rats came in, you'd be like, okay, all right, it's now time to clean the room, right? So you have that limit set, a few bugs, okay, fine. But once furry creatures get in the house that are unwelcomed, then we need to change this thing, right? So that's your intellectual boundary. What do I feel comfortable? I feel comfortable with allowing a few bugs in the house if it happens that way. I'm going to be able to be respectful of her because I'm not going to be yelling because her room is a mess, or I'm not going to nag her about this. We will be able to have a better interaction, and I'm comfortable with a few bugs. Rats and rodents, not comfortable. We'll then have to set a new boundary.
Yes,
does that make sense?
It is. I like it.
Yeah.
Like you have your own level of boundaries as a parent for whatever you can tolerate and whatever you can't. And then you might need to communicate it with your child and say, as long as this is the consequences, then you deal with it. But when it's getting a bigger consequence and when other people in the house are being affected by that, then in this case, I am sorry, but I can't tolerate it anymore. Is that
exactly?
Okay?
Yep.
I get that. And what about sometimes there are like disagreement? Like she would say, I think something, and then I would say, well, but I see it differently. So sometimes it could go into a power struggle, like who's right, who's wrong. And I want to hear your piece of advice on that.
Yeah, power struggles are never good. It depends on the situation. For example, let's just say your daughter loved rats and thought they were cute. What if she says like, no, I don't see it that way. Rats are really cute. Like maybe I could have a few pets, or they could be my friend. Like, I think I should be allowed to let my room get as messy as I want, even if rats come in, because rats are cute. then at that point, it's not going to be a power struggle because you say, okay, I would still validate that that's what they're thinking, that's what they're feeling. Because, your thoughts are your thoughts and your feelings are your feelings, and it's okay for you to have them. So I might say, I hear that you really think that rats are cute and you really want the opportunity to let your room get as messy as you want, even if there are rats. Right? So I would kind of pause there, let her have that. But in this house, we don't allow rats in. They carry diseases. So if I see a rat, I will, whatever the boundary that you're going to enforce. And I like when people do contracting, especially like an 11-year-old. And what that just means is that we've written this somewhere. We both know that it exists, right? We've set this kind of clear, I verbally said it, but it's also in writing, so it has some permanence to it. It also helps with your memory because sometimes we have few boundaries and we're like, what did I say would happen if this happened? It was like kind of good to write it down for the things that are like really serious and you really need to
So
be
with the
consistent about.
intellectual, I get that if it's just a conversation, we can agree to not agree. And this is me respecting her different opinion. But then you also talked about the difference between power struggle and setting boundaries. And what I got is I am, as a parent, needs to ask myself, is it something that I cannot tolerate? And that means that I'm really trying to holding a boundary versus I'm asking myself, is this just something that bothered me because I said so and she should align with it? So this is kind of how can I distinguish for myself, where am I at? And then to move forward after having this inner conversation.
Exactly. I also like to remind parents, if you can operate from a value system, whatever your values are, when you're interacting with your children and thinking like, is this a power struggle? If this, whatever, you want to say, is this in some way going against or aligning with my value? Whatever the specific value may be. Because usually as parents, there are certain values that we want them to like, oh my gosh, I want you to have this when you grow up. Like, I want you to be kind to others or respect other people's spaces or live a healthy life. There are certain values that you really want to instill. And so sometimes when we're in a power struggle, it's because it's attacking our value that we're trying to like instill in our children. And we really want that. So if it's incongruent with your value, then maybe it is something you need to set a boundary for. But it also means that your value should have been stated over and over and over in some way, shape, or form to your children.
I like the connection between values and boundaries, which is something that you made it really clear. Some of the boundaries we're setting for ourselves and for our kids is because we have some kind of value that we want to live by. For example, you just mentioned like all the routine that we talked about, habits like showering, it's actually the value is being clean and having a healthy life. So same goes with foods. It's just the same thing. It's like I'm setting those boundaries because I want my kids to have the best nutrition in their body. So I really love the connection. Thank you for that. It's awesome.
You're welcome.
I want to move on to the thing about time boundary, which I think it's kind of a simple one. It just, if my son say, I want to play with myself now, then I should just respect that and say, okay, go ahead. Or if he says, I'm not willing to play with friends now, also it's some kind of time boundary, right?
I'm not willing to play with friends now. Well, the now part, yes, it looks like it's time, but actually I would think of that one probably as either emotional or physical. Because I would think about that as I don't want to be in space with other children right now, or I don't have the emotional capacity. I just want to be with myself. So, but time, we really want to think about our scheduling, how long things happen, how long when things happen. So if it's going to, like you have an appointment or you're trying to get to a birthday party or school, exactly. You're trying to get to school on time. You're trying to, you may have homework time set up, right? Like after school, whatever. You might have things that have to happen or that you really want to happen around a certain amount of time, but then also the how much, right? So like you have 1 hour of screen time and the boundary is if you go over that screen time, then I'm going to take the tablet away or I'm going to whatever the case would be. So those are the time ones that are, and it is pretty simple because it's just like how long and when
Okay,
something
I get
occurs.
that. That was simple. Yay. I want to actually ask you something. We know nowadays that the long-term effect of punishment is not good. So we're trying to avoid those. So we're using the logic consequences, natural consequences. But then the best way to approach our kids nowadays, as far as I know, and you can, rephrase it, is using more of the compassion and curiosity. It's like asking, what do you need? What do you want? And then kind of find and compromise our child needs and our child desires. And my question for you is, if I have a kid ranges 3 to 11, how do I implement, or which one do I pick to implement? Could I use this, kind of discussion thing with my 3 years old? So I'm trying to get it more tangible for parents, because honestly, I'm telling you, my 3 years old is pretty firm one. And I can see myself having this whole dialogue with 3 years old.
Yeah.
So I'm really trying to organize my thought around that.
No, that's really good. Well, it's also thinking about where your child is. So a lot of I think that one of the challenges that we get into is when we're really thinking about boundaries is when we're in the heat of the moment, right? And then that the 3-year-old is not, none of us, honestly. If you're already in the emotional part of your brain, you don't have access then at that point to your frontal lobe, which is the front part of your brain, which is planning, organization, logical thought, right? It's our executive functioning. So if I'm in the emotional space and I don't have access to this logical space and you're over here trying to reason with me, it's not going to get through. It's just not happening. I don't have access to that part of my brain right now. And so when I have access to that part of my brain is when I'm calm. And children, a 3-year-old, they're going to have the access to their brain usually when they're playing and when they're the happiest. And play is usually when children are just like themselves in their own world. So whenever you're thinking about, okay, there's a boundary I'm going to want to set later, or there's values I'm trying to instill, we always say introduce that during play settings. So play with your child and actually play with them. Don't just like watch them play, but interact with them while they're playing. And like it might be a good opportunity to think about physical boundaries when you're playing. Let's just say your child snatches a toy from you because they really wanted to, maybe could have just been excited. Like, oh my gosh, that's so exciting. I snatch it. Then that could be a time where you say, oh, you snatched that from me. I don't play with my friends or I don't play with people when they snatch toys from me really quickly. And you just have made that statement. And maybe they've sunk in, maybe it didn't. But then what happens is the next time that they snatch something, then you say, oh, you snatched it again. Well, I'm not going to continue playing right now. We can try again later. And they can still keep playing, but you're not playing with them because you kind of set that boundary that said, I don't play when people snatch things from me. So the first thing is do it when they're calm. Try the strategies first when they're calm and usually starting them during play. And when they're really young, you're going to use fewer words than you're using with your 11-year-old. You're trying really hard to use really short sentences as much as possible because your 11-year-old has more vocabulary, more expressive language, and is going to be able to understand and express herself better than your 3-year-old. So these strategies can be used concretely throughout the age span, but they look different because you want to tailor them to your child's
first,
development.
I like the idea of introducing the boundary and the value when playing, because this is when the brain is able to gain those kind of ideas. And it does require from parents to sort of plan that ahead, right? You kind of think about what value do I want to talk about? How do I want to approach? Do I want to do it with a book or do I want to just, saying when I was a kid, blah, 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 and give the example. So the message is in there, but it does require, and I think this is one takeaway from this episode, is that we can just accept our kids to have those boundaries and know what is it, what the expectation and how to actually implement it. It's something that we need to work on the idea and break it into little milestones of how to get there, right?
Exactly. And you have to first know what the values are. What are the values I want to teach my child? You have to be intentional, right? And think about those things. And then you can find moments that it's a good opportunity, right? Some of these things are going to just naturally come up. You said that your son is strong-willed. He has his mind made up sometimes, and you're trying to figure out, well, how do I work through that. And I always say, well, one, you can use that for good, right? Because a strong-willed person, a strong-minded person can be a great leader sometime, one day. We just have to teach them to use their powers for good, right?
Yeah. You don't
Yeah,
want to
you're
like
like,
degrade it or not give it legit because it's just taking this superpower they have. But and also you have to be so patient. And like I want to ask you actually about that. If I'm using a certain consequence and dialogue
mhm.
and I'm repeating it over and over again, what would be a time frame that you could say, well, this type of dialogue or whatever is not working. We need to change it.
Oh, good one. So you mean repeating it over and over again, like over time?
Yeah, for specific example. Okay, so my child is getting angry and then he hits or he yells. And then I say, well, I can't let you hit me. And then we have some strategies. I can say, I can see that you're angry and it's okay to be angry. What do you want to do now? Like, and then he can push the wall. He can, breathe. We have those kind of things. And we've done it thousands of times. We've done it so much. So that's why I'm asking, what's the limit to say, well, this kind of thing is not working?
Very good. I would say that there isn't a perfect timeline, but if you've done it 1,000 times, if you've done it, you feel like you've done it for weeks and months on end, and you feel like you've been consistent in the way that you do that, then it means that the consequence isn't potent enough. So when we think about natural consequences and logical consequences, so say for instance, you want your child to like have their raincoat on or get an umbrella or something, and they say no, and you're like, okay, well, and then the natural consequences, it's raining outside, so they get wet, right? But maybe that was fun, and it was like, ha, I'm like playing in the rain, and I'm so much fun. So it was a natural consequence, but it didn't change the behavior; it probably reinforced the behavior. So then you might want to say, then we have to switch. So maybe at this point, I'm giving you these options, but these options are potentially, you're looking at them as playtime. Like, yeah, we're pushing, but like I'm giving you attention. So maybe what it is that when he hits, because you've done it a million times and you've set the boundary, we don't hit, then you remove yourself. You may remind him, you have all those things you can do, push the wall, whatever, you pick one, but mommy's going to go make lunch or whatever. Maybe you keep the same thing in place, but you make a tweak. Does that make sense?
Yep, it makes sense. It seems like we can tolerate stuff and we can patient, but there are a certain point that, as a parent, you need to reevaluate your tools and see if you need to change something. So
Exactly.
thanks for saying that. I think we need to go towards the end. So I want to ask you if there anything else you want to add.
I think it's just, remembering that parenting is a journey and you matter. So I want the parents out there to know that you matter and your emotional capacity is really important. And I say that because when we think about boundaries, it can be so hard to learn how to set them, to reinforce them. We have our guilt and our feelings and all those things. So you really have to make sure that you're doing things that you care for yourself. And we've used this analogy a million times. I got to find another one, but it's that mask on a plane analogy. So when they tell you if the oxygen masks come on, you put the oxygen mask on yourself first, and then you turn and help the ones that are with you, right? You turn and help your child, help the elderly person, whatever. And the reason for that is, let's just say, as you're trying to put the mask on your child and you didn't put yours on, what if you pass out? Now you don't have a mask on, the child doesn't have a mask on, nobody has a mask on, and you can't get appropriate oxygen. So if you aren't emotionally regulated, if you are in a place where you don't have the emotional capacity to do something, then you're not going to be able to instill or teach that value at that particular time to your child. So then you got to check in, do whatever you need to do to re-regulate, and then go back in fresh-faced and bushy-tailed to interact with your child. That's an intellectual boundary you can set for yourself of self-care.
I would even take what you said one step further and say, in a moment where I feel I don't have the emotional capacity to deal with something, I sometimes let go, even, a very high prioritized boundary of myself. If I feel like I can't handle it the way I wanted to do it, I'm like, okay, I'm just going to close my eyes at this moment and let it be.
Exactly. Yeah. Take your deep breath.
So I love that point. It just changes the game when you're so strict with yourself as a parent that you always have to do it. It's just respect your own humanity.
Exactly. To respect your own humanity, respect your own intellectual boundary. You are allowed to be human. There's no such thing as a perfect parent. We're all just doing our best,
We just need to model being a human being.
Yeah, exactly. Flaws and all. They need to see it all because they need to see how you recover from your mistakes. That's so important, right? If they think you're too perfect, then think about the unrealistic expectations they set on themselves, right?
Yes.
Yeah.
Thank you so much for being so genuine and sharing those type of boundaries. I think it's so essential for us, the parents, to know and be aware of those. So
Perfect.
once again, thank you.
Thank you. Alrighty. Bye-bye.
Hey, thank you for joining me for this conversation. I hope you find it helpful. If you want to reach out to Dr. Dowtin, she's available. She has her own practice, so you can contact her by website or by Instagram. All the things will be on the show notes. In addition, I will add the link to episode number 4 when we talked about the function of the behavior. And then if you really enjoy this episode, please share it with others because sharing is caring. In the next episode, we'll be talking about sex education for the young children, which is part of the boundary we just talked now. So stay tuned and remember to treat yourself and your kids with compassion and curiosity.